Welcome, everyone. I am Julie Zuckerman, author of the Book of Jeremiah, and welcome to the December Literary Modiin author event. This event was supposed to take place on October 15th and was postponed for obvious reasons. As you know, we're on day 58 of the war, and we're still waiting and praying for all of our hostages to return home and all of our soldiers to return home safely. At the end, we've had a couple of solidarity events, and then we have another one coming up in a few weeks. And I'll tell you more about that later. But at the end, after all the authors read, I'm going to say a few more words about the hostages. So for those of you who are new to Literary Modiin, we began about 4.5 years ago. I'm dialing in from Modiin, a city in central Israel. And this has grown into a monthly event with authors and attendees from all over the world. This is our 42nd event. The form of today's event is that each author speaks for about 15 minutes, and then we open it up to questions. We have a large attendance today, so everyone's on mute. So if you have questions as they're reading, you can put your questions in the chat box. And if you have any technical difficulties, just send those to me in a private chat, in a private note. As I mentioned, we're also broadcasting this live on Facebook in Literary Modiin. So hopefully more people will see it that way as well. Now, I now like to introduce our first author. Tara Ison is the author of 4 novels, including The List, A Child Out of Alcatraz, which is a finalist for the Los Angeles Times Book Prize, and Rockaway. Her short story collection is Ball, and her collection of essays, Reeling Through Life, How I Learned to Live, Love, and Die at the Movies, was the winner of the 2015 Penn Southwest Book Award for Creative Nonfiction. Her newest novel, At the Hour Between Dog and Wolf, is the story of a young Jewish girl in World War II France living in hiding as a Catholic orphan. The novel explores identity and survival and the insidious influence of anti-Semitic and fascist ideologies. So let me spotlight Tara, and you can take it away. Go ahead.
All right. Hi, everyone. First, I want to thank Julie for inviting me. It's really an honor to be here with you and Daniel and Linda. And my everyone is in my heart right now. I don't quite know what else to say. So yes, I'm going to talk a little bit about my book, At the Hour Between Dog and Wolf. And I'm going to go back to my stepmother, who came into my life when I was 12 years old. She was a hidden child in World War II Hungary. She was 5 years old, and during the war, her father was killed just before the war. And during the war, her mother took her out to live on a farm with a Catholic family, pretending to be an orphaned Catholic relative. And she was given a new name and a new history and taught the Catholic prayers. Basically told, don't make a mistake, don't talk to the police, don't call attention to yourself, and don't ever cry. And she was 5 years old. And when I heard that, when I was about 12, I was just really fascinated by that how do you take a very vulnerable mind, a child, and impose this other identity on them when they still are not sure who they are in the world. So in 1997, after I published my first novel, which is 30 years ago, I started thinking about what I wanted my next project to be. And I thought of this story of my stepmother's, and I started researching it. So I have been researching and working on this book for 25 years, and it really has been a labor of love. It is not my stepmother's story. My character is 12 years old. She's almost 16 when the novel ends. And I set the story in France because I felt a little more familiar with French culture and French history. Little did I know what I was getting myself into. I had heard of the Vichy government and their collaboration with the Nazis, but I wasn't fully aware what that entailed and how that split the French identity and culture into two. So again, my character is 12, and she starts out living in Paris with her parents, a little Jewish girl, rather spoiled, very sophisticated. And when she is left on this farm with this Catholic family, and her mother decides to go underground to try to survive the war. She is traumatized and terrified, and her world is turned upside down. She has lost both her father and her mother, and she is given a new name. She is taught the Catholic prayers, and she is told, don't ever, ever make a mistake. And if you make a mistake, the police will come kill all of us. So she is very terrified by all of this. And she does make a mistake. She's only 12 years old and decides she needs to commit more to this false identity, to this role that she's playing. And she does, to the point of, as the years go on, really getting lost in this new identity, to the point over the years of repressing, disavowing her Jewish heritage, her past, and fully embracing first Catholicism. She becomes a devout Catholic, but then fully embracing, because again, she is so vulnerable, fully embracing becoming indoctrinated, manipulated, propagandized into becoming an anti-Semitic fascist and a believer in the fascist, Nazi and Vichy ideologies. So when I started working on this book 25 years ago, I did not set out to write a political story. I was primarily interested in the psychology of the character, and how do you take a vulnerable mind, partly because she's a child, but also because she's terrified and hungry. The Vichy government and the German government were, under the guise of collaboration, were systematically starving the French. And the terms of the collaboration became increasingly brutal. So survival became very much a life and death issue for this girl. And I was interested in how you take a vulnerable, terrified mind and turn them into another person. Is that possible? So I would work on the book, I would research it, I would put it down for a while, I would write another book, I would pick it up, work on it for a while, put it down, write another book, et cetera, et cetera. And about 7 years ago, I hadn't looked at it in a while. I had gone on to write another book, and I picked it up, determined to finish it and find a home for it in the world. And I read through it again, and I was absolutely horrified, because scenes, dialogue, events of the world that I had written 10 years earlier, 5 years earlier, were happening all over again. I have scenes and dialogue in the novel that I was hearing global leaders saying on the news today. And again, it was horrifying how we are back to this global resurgence of anti-Semitism and fascism. So while the book takes place during World War II, it is unfortunately, disturbingly, very timely. So I'm just going to read a short paragraph. And this is actually from very early in the novel. My young girl, Danielle, is still living in Paris with her parents. Her father is still alive. The German occupation of Paris has happened. And initially, not too much seemed to change. Initially, things seemed to be sort of okay. So this girl is talking about how life seemed to go back to normal a little bit. That she and her father could still take walks together on Sunday afternoons the way they always did. And she says, yes, long walks with her father, just like always, the two of them together. Papa not caring about her messy braids or her gloves stuffed in her pockets, walking on slow Sunday afternoons until the sun began its drop, and they'd stop on the Pont Neuf to watch the candles and lamplights twinkle on in the buildings. Watch the colors change, Danielle, he'd say, pointing to the sky. Look how beautiful it is. Look at all the shadings, always changing, from silvery lemon over there to that deep sapphire. Look how it's turning to ink. It's like a painting. We're entre chien et loup at this hour. Now look carefully, and you show me the moment when day changes to night, when the light turns to dark. Can you see it? And she'd look and look, but could never see exactly when the shift happened, when the dog became the wolf. And that didn't change the twilight sky just because the Germans were there. Occupation, she thought, well, it isn't so bad. And of course, it becomes much worse. Her father is killed on the street by German soldiers very soon after that. So I had come upon, I didn't have a title for the book, and I had come upon that phrase in my research, entre chien et loup, which is a French idiomatic expression for twilight or dusk. And when I read that, I loved the sound of it. I loved the poetry. I loved the metaphor. I loved this idea of transformation, but also the fact that you can't pin it on one moment. It's this series of subtle shadings going from light to dark, the dog to the wolf, good to evil. And to me, that really captures the psychological essence of the story, is that as this girl moves through the war, it's these tiny, tiny little steps. It's these tiny, tiny little decisions she makes, at each point convincing herself she's doing the right thing. There's a epigraph to the book by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and he says, to do evil, a human being must first of all believe that what he's doing is good. And Danielle has to convince herself that what she's doing is the right thing as she makes a series of decisions that take her down a very, very dark path. So I really look forward to any questions anybody has, or anything they'd like to share. I have no doubt that many of you have family history during World War II. My stepmother is still alive, which I'm very grateful for. We're very close. And again, everyone is in my heart right now. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Tara. Thanks so much. I have lots of questions, but I'm going to wait. I'm going to hold my questions till the end. Okay, I'd like to introduce our next author. Daniel Victor specializes in writing Jewish-themed fiction and has written 3 novels, 2 novellas, and a collection of short fiction. The Evil Inclination is his first published novel. He practiced law for more than 40 years, concentrating on international media transactions, including 15 years as a senior executive for Sesame Street. He is a father and grandfather and lives in New York City with his wife, Esther Fuchs. So let me spotlight you. And take it away, Daniel.
Thank you, Julie. So it's just a tremendous honor to be participating in this global literary salon and to share this virtual stage with such accomplished writers as Tara and Linda. And I want to thank Julie for inviting me. I also want to thank Julie for continuing the series during such a challenging time for Israel and world Jewry, and particularly for starting and continuing the solidarity events with Israeli authors, which she has organized. And I think that I personally, but I think a lot of us here have really come to appreciate. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the novel and read an excerpt and then discuss some of the general themes of the book and what I had hoped to try to accomplish in it. Here's the book, The Evil Inclination. The Evil Inclination tells the story of Lev Levitsky, who is a devoted son and an upright young man who walks the path of Jewish observance without any second thoughts. But one day in college, he encounters Angela Pizzato, who's a dark-haired knockout, and suddenly what used to mean everything to him is no longer enough. Angela, whose journey is also recounted in the novel, pulls Lev from a prudish existence into a passionate romance that must remain a secret because she's Catholic and he's Jewish. And as the young lovers wander and gallivant throughout Brooklyn, and as their devotion to one another grows, they're headed towards really a pivotal crossroad. Can they possibly overcome the seemingly insurmountable barriers presented by their backgrounds? This is a question that they need to confront if they're ever to have a shared future with one another. Layered into the love story are themes about identity and longing, how desire, what traditional Judaism calls the evil inclination of the title, can define who we think we are, It's a novel that's not only about the burdens of tradition in conflict with passion, but also about the struggle to understand how the people we fall for can change us in very unexpected ways. I'm going to read an abridged version of the first chapter and then continue. Lev Levitsky held his breath as Rabbi Berkowitz leaned forward, one hand clutching the edge of the prayer lectern, the other hand stroking his reddish-brown beard. The foot of the stender was right at the edge of the dais. If it skidded just another inch or two, the rabbi would topple onto the students sitting in the first row of the assembly hall, a catastrophe that Lev had longed for since his first day of third grade. The rabbi was lecturing Lev and his classmates about the evil inclination and about the good inclination, how these forces struggled one against the other for dominion over them every minute of their lives. Berkowitz was animated. The subject apparently excited him. The opportunity to make a difference in molding the character of his third graders, setting them on the path to righteousness and steering them away from sin, even before they really had a clear idea of what sin was. Because of the unusual intensity of the presentation, Lev Levitsky stopped imagining Rabbi Berkowitz tumbling onto the first row and began listening to him. The rabbi paused for a moment, dramatically raised his fist in the air in front of his face, and for an instant, Lev was distracted by that fist, the way it looked clenching the air like the fist of God containing lightning or the wind, assuming that God in fact possessed a fist, which theologically, of course, he did not. Even at 8 years old, Lev thought he had a pretty clear notion of what evil was. Evil was doing what was prohibited, and he thought that he understood what good was, doing what was permitted, and also, of course, what was expected. But what Lev didn't know, and what Rabbi Berkowitz never bothered to explain to him or to anyone else, was what an inclination was. What did it mean to have an inclination to do the forbidden, an urge, a compulsion, an irresistible craving? One night, Lev was sitting at the dining room table in his parents' apartment in Flatbush doing Bible homework when he saw his mother motion to his father to join her at the kitchen sink. Lev knew that she wanted to whisper a secret. Lev's parents stood side by side. His mother whispered to his father, "Shlomi Strudler, he's off the derech. Golda told me." Lev's father didn't say anything, but he raised his hand to his black velvet skull cap and moved it around on the top of his head as if he were using it to wipe something wet and sticky off his cranium. He peered up at the sputtering fluorescent light like he was searching for God himself. "It was only a matter of time," Lev's mother continued. "The cigarette. You remember the cigarette, don't you?" Lev's father nodded. His parents' eyes met, and they both turned and gave Lev a grave, anxious look. Lev continued to pretend that he was studying. Lev knew what it meant to be off the derech. Derech in Hebrew meant path, and to be off it was to begin to drift away from Jewish observance, the 248 affirmative obligations and the 365 prohibitions that comprise the basic core of halacha, Jewish law. And Lev also knew about Shlomi Strudler and the cigarette. It had happened the previous year on the holiday of Simchas Torah. It was reported that Shlomi Strudler was smoking a cigarette, and when it had burned down to the filter, instead of letting it go out by itself, according to the rules of halacha, he threw it on the ground, put his shoe on it, and moved his foot back and forth to grind it out. Some people speculated that maybe Shlomi had forgotten and just did it by accident without thinking. But those who were there said he had a determined look on his face. Some said he had a defiant look on his face. No one said it was an accident. When Lev heard about it, he thought, that's wrong, to stomp on a lit cigarette on Simchas Torah instead of letting it go out on its own accord. That's just plain wrong. How could anyone who knew better do such a thing on purpose? Something that was so wrong. And now he had learned that Shlomi Strudler was off the derech. What Lev didn't understand was how Shlomi had gotten off it. Did he go to sleep one night while on it and in the morning wake up off it? Was he surrounded by rabbis wearing black coats and carrying sticks who forced him off, or did he fall off? The falling image was the most plausible. Lev visualized the derech as a narrow bridge without railings, one that spanned a chasm. The bridge was so high that its terminus was obscured by swirling clouds, and the chasm so deep that its floor could not be perceived. A solitary figure steadfastly made his way against a headwind that suddenly increased in velocity, turning into a howling tempest with torrents of rain and fiery barrages of lightning. Finally, after much struggle, the exhausted traveler toppled off the bridge and into the chasm. That's the way Lev imagined it, but it was not the way it happened to him. So once again, here's the book. The end of chapter 1. The second chapter opens 12 years after the first, when Lev Levitsky is 20 years old and a sophomore at Brooklyn College. And it's there that he meets Angela Pizzato and begins their secret love affair, which so unravels their respective parochial lives. So let me start by explaining briefly how I came to write a novel about interfaith star-crossed lovers. Specifically, I was intrigued by the challenges of living a religious, observant Jewish life in the modern world. And I've noticed over the years that there's so many highly educated Jewish young men and women raised by loving and supportive families who go to cutting-edge Jewish educational institutions and emerge with great secular educations and religious educations, and yet who fall away from Jewish observance as they become independent young adults. The novel refers to this phenomena as falling off the derech, a term which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And I wanted to examine in depth what it means to fall off the derech, what motivates it, and how it affects those who experience it, and how it resolves itself, if it ever does. At the same time, I had a broader objective, which was to write fiction that's grounded in Jewish content, and namely Jewish texts. So this novel is really steeped in classical Jewish rabbinic texts, namely the Babylonian Talmud. The protagonist, Lev Levitsky, is a highly educated Orthodox Jew. He swims quite comfortably in the oceans of the Talmud. Lev, although he's ensnared by his obsession with his Catholic girlfriend, he nevertheless continues throughout the novel in a sporadic dialogue with the sages of the Talmud, even as his passion for Angela deepens. To the rabbis of the Talmud, the evil inclination reflected human impulses with which they were very, very familiar, but the power of which they couldn't quite understand. So the paradigm for the evil inclination for them was the power of erotic desire. And our rabbis of the Talmud did not condemn the evil inclination for sexual desire, and they didn't demonize it, but they were mystified by it, by its power over us and how difficult it is to struggle against it and overcome it. The novel is divided into 9 parts, each of which is introduced by an excerpt from the Talmud that expresses this rabbinic attitude towards illicit sexual desire, and at the same time thematically foreshadows events that ensue in the chapters that follow. So the rabbinic conception of the evil inclination is not only the title of the book, but it's the narrative and conceptual framework for the novel. I wanted the book to be immersed in the Talmud, but I also wanted the narrative not just to feature Talmudic stories and legal rules and principles in brief interludes. I wanted to integrate them into the storyline, into the plot line. So as mentioned earlier, the Talmud speaks to Lev throughout the novel, whether he likes it or not, and particularly at those moments when he's engaged in what I might say is distinctly un-Talmudic behavior. Another objective I had in mind, I wanted the Jewish protagonist to be ensnared by the powerful attractions of a secular life, but not turned off to a religious life. Because I think we see too many narratives and a lot of memoirs featuring religious Jews who fall away from their observance because their families and their communities are stultifying and rigid, or their rabbis are oppressive or hypocritical, or corrupt and even predatory sometimes. But we know, I've observed, put it that way, that religious people often experience crises of faith and observance, not because religious life is too harsh or tyrannical, but because the allure of the secular realm is just simply too overwhelming. So I wanted to tell of a protagonist who is from a warm and loving religious family, who nevertheless succumbs to the temptations of a secular modernity. And as a correlate to the above, I wanted the religious protagonist to struggle with remaining observant, even as he succumbed to the temptations of the outside world. So this book is not about a young man who meets a non-Jewish, beautiful woman and then blithely turns his back on his family and religious life without looking back. So the novel is an exploration of a secret, illicit love affair between two very different human beings. One seductive, sexually experienced, foul-mouthed, and brazen. That's Angela, by the way, in case you haven't figured it out. And the other, chaste, inexperienced, prudish. That's Lev. And their, their tug of war, maybe, is a better term. Their tug of war is the fuel of this story, which explores the depths of erotic desire, as I said, and as a result, the novel contains profanity, some nudity, and some sex. And my decision to write a novel in which there is some R-rated content was not something I took lightly, but I felt to dissect the dynamics of erotic desire while at the same time trying to sanitize it would have made the story didactic and inauthentic, and I just really didn't want to have that type of a story. In writing the novel, I visualized a reading audience that was really comprised of Jewish readers with more than a passing familiarity and interest in Jewish practice and texts. I didn't think that Haredi or Black Hat Jews would want to read the book because it's a little bit too controversial, or purely secular Jews. And I didn't think non-Jewish readers would find it interesting, but the most gratifying development since publication is that I've gotten a lot of positive feedback from those populations I didn't anticipate would find the book appealing, including Christian readers and even Catholic readers. And believe me, there's a lot of back and forth between Lev and Angela in the novel about the shortcomings of the Catholic Church. And I've even heard from one or two Haredim who liked the book. I would like to go into my writing biography and some of the process of writing, but I don't want to take more than my 15 minutes, so I'm going to stop now, turn it back to Julie, and if there's time at the end, if there's some questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Thank you again for this opportunity to talk with you.
Thank you, Daniel. Fascinating subject. And I think you described it well, the tug of war between Lev and Angela. That's a good way of putting it. Okay, let me introduce our third author. Linda Kass is the author of 2 historical novels, Tassa's Song and A Richie Boy, the 2021 IPPY Gold Medal winner in historical fiction. Bessie, her new novel, was named a Hasty Book List most anticipated historical fiction title for 2023. Linda began her career as a magazine journalist and correspondent for regional and national publications. She's the founder and owner of Gramercy Books, an independent bookstore in Columbus, Ohio. So, Linda, I'm going to put you on the spotlight and go ahead.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Julie. I'm delighted to join Tora and Daniel and to have this wonderful opportunity to meet virtually with authors and readers in Israel and throughout the world. I echo Tara and Daniel's comments of appreciation to you for offering this wonderful global literary salon. I thought I might briefly share with you my writing background. You kind of went over that a little bit. I'm not going to offer too much more, but how I came to write Bessie, a novel about Bess Meyerson, and then offer some highlights from the book. So my writing career began in the late 1970s during graduate school at Ohio State University, where I was completing my master's degree in journalism. While there, I began writing investigative magazine stories for the city magazine called Columbus Monthly. And then later, I wrote feature articles for regional and national magazines, particularly after moving to Detroit, where I was a part-time correspondent for Times Detroit Bureau, and I also wrote for the Detroit Free Press Sunday magazine. It was in 2008 when I pivoted to creative writing, taking numerous university workshops to learn the craft of writing fiction. My first novel, Tassa's Song, was published in 2016, inspired by my mother's early life in Eastern Poland before and during World War II. My second novel in stories, A Richie Boy, came out during the pandemic in 2020, and it was inspired by my father's experience as a young immigrant from Vienna, recruited by the U.S. Army to serve as a military intelligence officer in World War II. So both of my two early books were similar to Tora's novel of being inspired by her stepmother. I was inspired by these stories of my parents and ended up writing fictional accounts of those experiences. It was in early 2020, as I was awaiting publication of A Richie Boy, when I came across an article about Bess Meyerson that mentioned her winning the Miss America title, something to which I was well aware. I've known about Bess Meyerson most of my adult life. She was always referred to as the first and only Jewish woman to win the Miss America title, and she was an iconic figure, probably the most famous of the long list of women crowned Miss America because of the many things she did since winning the title. She became known in the early years of American television, featured on popular talk and game shows, and I first knew of her as a panelist on the weekly primetime show, I've Got a Secret. Then she became one of the most powerful women in New York City politics, even unsuccessfully running for the U.S. Senate. I was especially aware of her work when I lived in New York City. She was Commissioner of Cultural Affairs, a position she held under Mayor Ed Koch in the 1980s. But stamped on the page of the article I read was also the date Bess Meyerson won the crown, September 8th, 1945, a date that hadn't had a place in my memory over the years, but stopped me the moment I read it, because I knew how unlikely her win had to have been. I mentioned my first two novels were set during World War II, and that both of my parents lived in Europe and directly experienced the war. So I realized that the date I encountered by chance was 6 days after the official end of World War II, just weeks after bombs hit Japan, during months when the horror of the Holocaust was seeping into news stories. Anti-Semitism, racism, sexism, and classism were pervasive attitudes. The war pushed much of the anti-Semitism behind the scenes, but it was still very potent in 1945. The parallels to what we're seeing today made Bess Meyerson's early story extremely relevant. And the significance of naming a Jewish woman like Bess Meyerson to this visible title representing American women at that time drove me to learn more about the events leading to that fateful day. So the first thing I did was go to the library, where I found and read several biographies about her life. I learned that Bess Meyerson's upbringing was at direct odds with the beauty queen image the world has of her today. Her parents were Russian immigrants. She had an older and a younger sister. The family was poor. Like many working class Jews, her parents left their inner city New York neighborhood just before the Depression hit and moved to a single bedroom flat in the multi-building complex known as the Sholem Aleichem Cooperative Houses in the Bronx, where Bessie grew up. They lived mostly among Eastern European Jews like themselves, many being musicians and artists. At 12, Bessie was nearly 6 feet tall, and she was mocked for her height. She was a piano prodigy, and she had lofty music aspirations. Her blossoming beauty was really a quality of little value to her, having been conditioned to only consider scholarship and talent as success. Yet, she's entered into this pageant, and despite the forces against her, she succeeds for her talent and brains, and then achieves notoriety for her voice against racism and hate. So I found all of this inspiring and committed myself to write a novel about Bess Meyerson. So through the story of her early life, I could explore the themes of beauty and talent, of family and friendship, of identity and belonging, of finding purpose, and of bigotry. So given her background, the obvious question is, why did Bess Meyerson enter the secular world of a beauty pageant? After all, music, education, and achievement were coveted in Bessie's world, not beauty. If I could digress for a moment, I wanted to share why I only focus on Bess Meyerson's early life. I chose to begin when she was 12, already her adult height of nearly 6 feet tall, and follow her through age 22 during her reign as Miss America. I chose to inhabit her character before she became a celebrity, during a period that led to her moment in the spotlight with all eyes upon her. I'm drawn to historical fiction, and this period of 1936 to 1946 was a charged cultural era. There are many parallels making it relevant to the attitudes we see today, as I mentioned earlier. And creating a human story, which we can do in fiction, brings that history to life as the witnesses of that era are dwindling quickly. Music fills each of my novels, so Bessie's maturing talent as a pianist was a large element I wanted to explore. She was 9 years old when she had her first piano lesson. Her family sacrificed to pay for her music lessons and then for a battered secondhand baby grand piano. Bessie's life began to revolve around music when her lessons moved to the Upper West Side Manhattan studio and outside of her very Jewish enclave in the Bronx to her new piano teacher, Dorothea La Follette. It was Dorothea who suggested that Bessie apply to the new High School of Music and Art, the legacy of Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia. It was located near the City College in Manhattan at that time, and she could learn there alongside the most extraordinary musicians from all 5 boroughs in New York City. Under her teacher's tutelage, Bessie dreamed of being a soloist or a conductor. Finally, as a fiction writer, I'm most interested in the early development of my protagonists, what some call coming of age or Bildungsroman. And there was much to draw from as I fictionalized Bessie's evolving moral and psychological growth. So I returned to the question about Bessie Meyerson entering a beauty pageant. Just as World War II began, she entered Hunter College as a music major, the only affordable choice to continue her schooling. As the end of her college days neared, Bessie's older sister, Sylvia, submitted photographs to the Miss New York City competition, knowing there was a talent component and a win that offered cash and a future. She convinced Bessie that it wasn't just a beauty contest. So it is the scholarship money that drew Bess to this beauty pageant. At the end of World War II, all the free money for education and scholarships was allocated to returning GIs, as they should have been. It turned out that the only place thinking about what girls needed at that moment was the beauty pageant in Atlantic City, where the winner would receive a $5,000 scholarship. But one more factor made Bessie determined to win the title once she was a contestant. By the spring of 1945, everyone saw these horrible images of emaciated individuals as photographers were invited with reporters into concentration camps. There were 5 million American Jews who just lost 6 million Jews in the Holocaust, and they saw themselves in the piles of bodies on Movietone News. For them, Bess Meyerson was a symbol. She took them out of their nightmare and proved to them that they were still alive. The road to winning the Miss America title was rife with misogyny and anti-Semitism. I'd like to briefly read a scene that takes place at a rehearsal for the Miss New York City pageant, where Bessie first meets Lenora Slaughter, the director of the Miss America pageant. Lenora wears a flashy orange silk dress and bright red lipstick. She speaks fast with self-assurance. I intend to make the pageant the first major national event of the peacetime era. Lenora leans even closer to Bessie, a musk scent overpowering, her voice barely a whisper. She reminds Bessie that the winner will receive a $5,000 scholarship. There is a very strong possibility you might become Miss New York City tonight, and then you'll have a good shot at being Miss America and winning that scholarship. If that happens, what would you like to do? Bessie's heartbeat quickens as she tries to process the full meaning of Lenora's words. She wonders if this forceful woman gives the same message to each finalist as a test. What is the right answer here? I would continue studying piano, buy a new instrument, maybe a baby grant. I could start a music school. I could even go to graduate school. I wanted to go to college more than anything in the world, but I didn't have the money, Lenora said, edging back in her seat. This scholarship gives you girls options. I had to fight the board to make this happen, had to raise the money to fund it. Bessie listens intently, sizing up this woman before her. How did you go about that? Raising money, that is. Just convincing businesses there's a value to exposure. Catalina swimsuits, for example. Now their suits will be Miss America's crowning uniform. Lenora shares that she wrote letters to 230 companies who sold products a beauty queen might endorse. I even recruited the executive director of the Association of American Colleges and Universities to head our new scholarship program. Bessie considers what she's heard. Lenora Slaughter is a bright woman who knows exactly what she wants and gets things done, and she's succeeding in a man's world. Bessie wonders what Lenora has given up, achieving all that she has. I hope that I can attain in music what you've been able to accomplish in your field. That scholarship money is why I'm here. Yes, but you've got to be flexible, Bess. What if music doesn't work out for you? You might also decide to go into show business or the movies. Many girls do. Lenora smiles, exposing her big white teeth. Several seconds of silence pass as she seems to consider her next words. And you need to consider all the things that could get in your way if you choose that path. For an instant, Lenora turns away and Bessie thinks their conversation is over until the pageant director suddenly blurts, Bess Meyerson is just not a very attractive name for a career in show business. I really have no intention of going into show business. Bessie feels her face get hot. Well, even for this competition, changing it couldn't hurt. Bessie knows it's an ordinary thing to do. People with ethnic names change them. Lauren Bacall was born Betty Persky. Cary Grant was Archie Leach. Kirk Douglas understandably changed his name from Izor Danilovich. What would you suggest? Lenora doesn't apply immediately. Maybe Betty, Merrick, or something like that. Bessie eases back in her seat, and then something hits her like a gut punch. Papa, having survived a pogrom as a child in Russia, told her to remember who she was. He meant being a Jew. Bessie senses something leaking from Lenora's deliberate affect, something deeper than the desire for a name change. She realizes suddenly that she is dealing with Lenora's own bigotry, her attitude about having a Jewish contestant and potentially a Jewish winner. Bessie clears her throat, tightens the white scarf around her head. No, I'm not going to change my name. Lenora's face tenses, her brows tighten. If I win this contest tonight, the only people who will really care are my family and the families I've grown up with. My friends from Hunter and high school, my campers, and if I win, and my name is Betty Merrick, they won't know it's me. I want them to know it's me. So I think I have to keep my own name. I am Bess Meyerson. Midway into the year of her reign, Bessie was introduced to top executives at the Anti-Defamation League through a family friend. She happily signed on to become the face of a racial tolerance campaign called the Brotherhood Campaign, and she communicated the message from coast to coast that you can't be beautiful and hate. Here was a platform from which Bessie could advocate for social justice, which became for her a lifelong calling. I'll stop here. I'm happy to later talk about my writing process, the research I did, and any other topic of interest to viewers. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you very much. That was great. She's certainly a very fascinating character, Bess Meyerson. Okay, there are please put your questions in the chat. While you're doing that, I did not want to let this night go by without, again, saying a few more words, and what's something that helps me, which is saying like 2 minutes of prayers for the captives and our soldiers. So I'm going to put that up on the screen. If you've been at the solidarity events, you've seen me do this already. If not, just bear with me, and while you're thinking of your questions, and if you're not the praying type, feel free to turn off your volume for a minute or two and jot down your own notes or your own writing. But I'm going to do this as of the number of hostages that we believe still to be in Gaza keeps shifting as they're identifying more remains. But the last number I saw just a little while ago was 125 people still in Gaza, including many people that my family is connected to. So I'm just going to read the Hebrew. You can follow along in the English. מי שברך אבותינו אברהם יצחק ויעקב יוסף משה ואהרון דוד ושלמה הוא יברך לשמור ולנצור את נדרי צבא הגנה לישראל ואת כל אזרחי ישראל ושבוייו ואת כל אחינו הנתונים בצרה ושבויה בעבור שכל הקהל הקדוש הזה מתפלל בעבורם. הקדוש ברוך הוא ימלא רחמים עליהם ויוציאם מחושך וצל מוות ומוסרותיהם ינתק ומצוקותיהם יושיעם ישבם מהרה לחיק משפחותיהם. יודו לאדוני חסדו ונפלאותיו לבני אדם וקבוים בהם מקרא שכתוב תהיה אדוני ישובון ובאו ציון ברינה ושמחה עולם על ראשם ששון ושמחה ישיגו ונשאו יגון והנחה ונאמר אמן. Last week we saw 105 people return to their families, so I hope that the others will return very soon. And I also want to say Mishaberach Hotzal, Mishaberach Avotenu Avraham Yitzchak Yaakov Yivrach et Chayalei Tzva Hagana Yisrael Bomdim al Mishmar Artzenu V'Arei Eloheinu מגבול הלבנון ועד מדבר מצרים ומן הים הגדול עד לבוא הערבה ביבשה באוויר ובים. ותן אדוני את אויבינו הקמים עלינו ניגפים לפניהם. הקדוש ברוך הוא ישמור ויציל את חיילינו מכל צרה וצוקה, מכל נגע ומחלה, וישלח ברכה והצלחה בכל מעשה ידיהם. ידבר שונאינו תחתיהם ויתרם בכתר יהושע ויתר ניצחון. יקוים בהם הכתוב כי אדוני אלוהיכם ההולך עמכם להילחם לכם עם אויביכם להושיע אתכם ונאמר אמן. And while I'm still sharing my screen, I want to point out that we have lots of upcoming events. After tonight's event, we have, in 2 weeks from now, the third Solidarity event where we'll hear readings from Israeli and some non-Israeli writers, including myself there, and Rachel Nevin Mebar, Tali Kark, Jonathan Dunsky, Erica Dreyfus, Sarah Sassoon, and maybe some more. And then in January, we have 2 literary Modiin events with Annie Katara, Adam Mansbach, and Nancy Ludmer, who's here tonight. And then an in-person and hybrid event at the end of the month, which was also rescheduled with Janice Weitzman, Jennifer Lang, and Ruth Marks Eglash. So I'll stop sharing now and I'll look at the chat, and I'm going to add all of our authors to the spotlight. Where'd you go, Linda? There you are. Okay. And now I'm going to look at the questions. Okay. Okay, this is from Ellen Tuckman. Are the books in paperback and do they have discussion guides? Or are they in the libraries? So you all answer that. You might have answered some of it in the chat. I didn't see.
Well, mine is in paperback. It does have a study guide. You can get it on at my website. And it is not yet available in libraries.
I see, Tara, you answered that already, that it's in paperback.
Yeah, and my book is in both hardcover and paperback.
Okay.
And available in bookstores and libraries.
Okay, I see a lot of comments to you all. I don't see any questions. If I missed a question, let me know. But I have a few questions while people are thinking. First, I'll ask Linda. So, are you going to write a sequel about the second part of Bess Meyerson's life?
No, I don't plan to do that. I guess I never say never. But to answer your question, Julie, I really found her early life to still be a mystery. I mean, part of writing is to discover things, and a lot of what happened in her later life was covered in biographies in more detail, and I could take these touch points I learned about her early life and then really imagine across them, and in that way, create this fictional reimagining of Bessie Meyerson's early life. So I doubt that I would recreate anything in fiction to follow this up.
Okay, I see there's a question from Beth for Daniel, but I also want to ask, I guess it's applicable to all of you. Was the ending to your novel preconceived, or did it evolve as you were writing the book? So Daniel, why don't you start out, and then if Tara.
Well, my ending, I would say, is, if not a surprise, it's generally unanticipated. So I don't like to discuss it too much. But no, the ending to my novel was in fact preconceived. I find, though, that a lot of what happened between the beginning and the ending kind of developed as I wrote the novel, and as I delved deeper into some of the sources were quite informative to me in terms of how to handle the plot and also the development of the characters.
Tara, what about you? Did you know your ending?
I had a rough idea. I generally do in my stories and my novels have a rough idea because it it gives me something to aim for. I think it's Toni Morrison who said she always begins with the ending. She always knows the ending first and writes toward it. At the same time, I leave myself a lot of room to, go with the flow and see what's happening with my characters and make changes if need be. The hard thing with this one was not so much figuring out what the end should be, but the execution of it. The last 10, 15 pages, I rewrote dozens and dozens of times to try to get the tone right. So it was a difficult one because it's a very complex emotional and psychological experience she's having. So.
And I guess you knew sort of what the.
Well, I took touch points from her life, and because I am dealing with an actual, this iconic, consequential figure. My process is I do a lot of thinking about what I'm going to write in my head, so that when I actually sort of start writing, I do enter that process with a sense of the beginning and a sense of the end. I need that. I mean, that's sort of my bookmark. And I sort of knew this last scene would be where it was in this last chapter for her. I had no idea how I would end that chapter or what, how I would kind of, where it would go from beginning to the end. But and that's the discovery process in the writing. But I did have these kind of checkpoints or touch points that I followed that I felt helped develop this character, Bessie Meyerson.
There's a couple more questions. Did Tara interview her stepmother at any point in her life to learn more about her experience? And did Linda interview Bess's daughter or any living friends?
It's funny, because I was just typing a response to that. My stepmother always was very willing to discuss this. Again, I learned when I was 12 years old. So I did ask her a lot of questions. She was only 5, so she remembers a couple of specific things, but not a lot. But I did interview her, do sort of a formal sit-down interview with her for the Hidden Child Foundation. That went out with their newsletter. And the transcript of that interview, where I learned things I didn't know, is up at my website. If you're not a member of if you're not on the Hidden Child Foundation newsletter mailing list, you wouldn't get it. But here's my website, and I encourage everyone to check it out. She's an extraordinary woman.
To answer Diana on this, I chose not, first of all, because I dealt with her early life. It was her life before she was married, before she had children. And I had enough information from one particular biography where Bess Meyerson actually participated in that biography. And there were sections where you could hear her voice and understand sort of, where she was coming from. So for my purposes, there was nothing to be gained by interviewing her daughter. I knew she had a daughter and that her daughter lived in California, but I never reached out and tried to reach the daughter. I'm not aware of what living friends she had. I didn't really, I wanted to try, since I was dealing with a real life figure, I was reimagining it. And so I wanted, I did a lot of research, but I really wanted to let my imagination also take a part in this. Interestingly, my earlier 2 books I mentioned were based on both of my parents. So like Tora, I interviewed both of them. I mean, I did that as a daughter of, individuals who, for history purposes, that the rest of our family would know from where they came, and so I did know their life, and they both knew I was going to be writing a fictional account inspired by their life. So, and they were both in agreement. So, but in this case, no.
So, so there's a follow-up question to that, Linda, for you from Nancy, who also has written a historical novel, and she's going to be at our next event in January. She asked, were there letters and other documents available relating to Bess's earlier life, notwithstanding her humble beginnings, they were able to use or extrapolate from?
Yeah, in that one biography that I referenced earlier, she had little snippets from a diary that she included during the pageant. In there, as I said, her own comments about certain aspects of growing up were in there. So that offered that kind of information for me that allowed me to stay true to what happened to her and then imagine through it. And I kind of get into, in my author's notes in the back of the book, I sort of touch upon why I used real names versus not real names, or, where fact and fiction departed. So I tried to give illustrations of that for the reader in the back. So.
Okay, I have a question for Daniel. Oh, someone asked a question also, Daniel, if you're planning a sequel, but my question is, maybe you can answer both of them. How have religious and secular readers reacted to the book?
Well, I think as I alluded to, the big surprise for me, I really wrote the book for a modern Orthodox kind of community, like the one that I have in my synagogue here in Manhattan. But I think, as I mentioned, across all denominations, very secular Jews have all responded very positively to the novel. Other modern Orthodox communities that I've had an opportunity to present to have responded positively. And I found that Christians as well, particularly Catholics, I think because after all, this is a story about a journey of someone who falls away from faith and observance. And I think it's not unusual to meet adult Catholics who have, at least at some point in their lives, become, quote, lapsed. And they find that the journey of the protagonist, Lev, speaks to them quite deeply, notwithstanding that Angela Pizzato is, of course, a Catholic, but I think that they're more interested in how he's attempting to cope with the struggle to resolve his faith and observance with modernity. And if I could just say, there is a sequel. I wrote a sequel when I was so into these characters that right after I finished the first draft of the novel, I continued and wrote a sequel, which I don't recommend because strategically it's not a very smart way to save your to spend your time, particularly if you don't know whether you're ever going to publish the first one. But there is a sequel.
Great. That's good. That's good to hear. But you were asked if you have another book in progress. So if you already have the sequel, do you have
I have
another
the
book?
sequel, and as you put in my bio, I also wrote 2 other novels and a collection of short fiction. But so they're all kind of waiting to be
Okay.
dealt.
And Tara and Linda, what are you working on now?
I can't face another novel right now. It was my 4th one, and like I said, yeah, I've been working on it for 25 years. So I'm just working on some short fiction and some essays.
I have had an idea for quite a long time, and I don't have a lot of headspace right now because my book came out in September, and this has kind of been a real busy fall for me in terms of touring for it, which has been really wonderful. But I am also a bookstore owner, and I also curate all our author event programs, which you have one a week. So I'm pretty busy, and I need to have a little bit of space to, get things moving in terms of getting on the page. I have developed I've started to develop some characters, a setting. It's not during World War II, I can say that. And it takes place in the Midwest. And it is of a coming of age sort of, again, story. But that's about all I want to say right now, because I'm just not close enough to getting into that first chapter yet.
Judy's asking a question to all 3 of you. If anti-Semitism is influencing the publishing world today, or you specifically? Have you felt anything?
I will say that it was very, very difficult to get this book published. Does that have anything to do with anti-Semitism? I don't know. The rejections, nobody said the book's too Jewish. I don't know. I mean, I'm Jewish. My publishers are Jewish. I'm not, other than that, I don't know if it's happening. And it wouldn't surprise me if it's happening in places. I'm very curious to hear what Linda and Daniel have to say to that.
I would say to you that, and I say this with my bookseller hat on, I don't see anti-Semitism as a bookseller. We publish books and see books coming out that are a range of cover a range of religions, race, thoughts, opinions. So, so I really don't see that. And in fact, I see some really interesting kinds of Holocaust related books out. In fact, some that were coming up in our author programming that I'm excited to feature. So I'm not seeing that in the publishing world, and I didn't really see it as an author either. So
I would just have to say this book, which is obviously pitched to a Jewish readership, I had a tremendously difficult time finding an agent and finding a publisher. But I don't think it's because of anti-Semitism. I think because it fails to fall into categories which either the agents or the publishers say, "Oh, I know that book. This book will appeal to this audience." And I think that things that are a little bit idiosyncratic and outside the norm it's really hard to get anyone's attention to read the book carefully and see the merit of the book. That's just my experience.
Okay, that's good to hear, because I've been hearing other things in the wake of the war.
That was last year, Julie.
Yeah,
We'll see
true. Okay. So enough. There were other questions in the chat. Do you have questions for each other?
I was going to ask Daniel, I wondered if you followed the work of Chaim Potek, only because, I started thinking of certain books I haven't read them in a long time, but I just love the work of Chaim Potek, and some of, what you talked about sort of made me trigger that in me.
Yes, I mean, of course, he's kind of the pioneer, really, at least in English language fiction in America about religious Jews. So, of course, he's a great inspiration. I find that Singer's work, particularly his I.B. Singer's work, particularly his quote American novels like Shadows on the Hudson. Also, my stuff, though, I think is fairly unique in the fact that it really tries to integrate Jewish texts into the characters and the plot line in a way that at least I haven't seen in the English language literature. And of course, there's so much Yiddish literature that was lost and not translated. And unfortunately, my Hebrew isn't good enough to read stuff coming out of Israel that hasn't been translated. But yes, Potok, a big inspiration.
I've been here for almost 30 years and my Hebrew is not good enough either. I mean, I have struggled through one Hebrew book. But I usually wait till the translation comes out. Because there's just so many books I want to read. And if I have to take me 2 months to read one book, then but actually that reminds me, I wanted to ask Tara, do you speak French? Did you have to do a lot of research in French?
I went to school in France for a year in college, and I've sort of kept up with it a little bit. My French is terrible, but it is good enough that I have had many research trips to France that it was invaluable in archives, libraries. There are materials that are only in French. Certain museums don't have translations up. So yeah, it was. I'm not sure how I don't think the book would have worked quite as well if I weren't pretty familiar and comfortable with French.
This is my, I think when I finish my current novel and stories, which was almost done till before October 7th, and now it's taken a bit of a break. But I have a family story also with a hidden child in France and a whole thing in France. So I read.
We have to talk about this. We don't need to do it right now, but
yeah,
we have to talk about that.
Definitely have to talk about this. And after reading The Postcard by Anne Buress, did you all read that? Wonderful book. Really agree. I was like, okay, I know what my next book has to be. I have to write about my family. But my French, is high school level, junior high level, probably. So, okay, there was one more question in the chat for Linda. Could you share with the group how you decided which characters would have their real names and which names you would make up?
Well, when I was talking about a character who was a real character, I wanted to acknowledge them. So I think that I was asked in a private chat about Lenora Slaughter, because it seemed like a real perfect name to give a character like her, but that was actually her name.
Mm.
And there were, when it was a person who actually had a relationship with Bess Meyerson that I had found in research, I included the real name. So Dorothea La Follette was her piano teacher, and I included her name. There was someone who I discovered was, for example, at the High School of Music and Art, that I bring out as it becomes a real friend to her, but he wasn't really, I don't know that. So I gave him a different name. There was one character. So when she went into the Miss America pageant, and, people were writing about it, and they knew she was from the Bronx and likely didn't have money to wear gowns. So someone from 7th Avenue, a designer, contacted her and was donating 3 gowns to her. And his name was Sam Kass, like my last name. So I changed his last name because I didn't want someone to stop on that last name and think that he was related to me. So I changed his last name to, something similar, but not that. So I think I explain much of this in my author's note, similar to explaining sort of some things that were fact versus fiction.
Okay, we're just about out of time, so I want to thank Tara and Daniel and Linda very much, and I want to encourage all of you who are on the call to go out and get their books and bring them to your book clubs and other places they can be discussed. And tomorrow I'll send out a recording and links to the authors' websites and reminders to sign up for our next events. So thank you all very much for spending time with us today, and good luck to all of you as you're writing your next things.
Thank you,
Thank
Julie.
you.
Thank you for
Thank
the
you.
work you do.
Thank
Okay.
you.
So much.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
everyone.
Besorotobot, as we say here. We hear good news soon.
Amen.
Yeah.
Bye.